Okay, this is the big part of the cells topic. We're learning about all the organelles inside cells and what they do. So your success criteria are you should be able to list all the organelles that are found in eukaryotic cells and describe the function of them so that you can really have a picture of how cells function. First question, what's an organelle? Well, organelles are compartments or structures in a cell and they have specific functions. So remember, we're always thinking structure and function in biology. Organelles look different because their structure matches their function. And if you think of the word organelle, E-double-E just means tiny. So it just means tiny organ. And that's basically what they are. They're the organs of the cell. The first two organelles are cytosol and cytoplasm. So all the organelles in plant and animal cells, they're in the liquid region, which is called the cytosol, which is purely just the liquid. You might have heard of cytoplasm, and technically that is the cytosol plus the organelles combined together. That makes the cytoplasm. The nucleus is then separate, so you don't count the nucleus in the cytoplasm. All right, ribosomes is next. And I'll talk about the structure and the function as we go of all these organelles. So you should be able to describe what they look like and then describe how they work, which is their function. The structure of ribosomes is they're made of two subunits. You can see down here, a large and a small, and they look like two hands sort of praying together. And they're actually made of a type of RNA called ribosomal RNA. Different to mRNA, which is involved in making proteins. The function of ribosomes, well, it is related to mRNA. It's to produce proteins, and it uses the mRNA as its code. We'll learn more about that later. So they use that coded information on the mRNA to make all the proteins for the cell. And the ribosomes, as you can see, they can either be just free in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol, or they can be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. And then we call it the rough endoplasmic reticulum because it's covered in all these little dots, which are the ribosomes. Ribosomes are one of the most important organelles, and they actually evolved as one of the first organelles in the first cells. They're so important because proteins are the worker molecules that do basically every job in a cell. Proteins transport things, they send messages, they store chemicals, they give structure to the cell, they build up our body like hair and fingernails are all made of keratin protein. Proteins also digest things, they react, they cause reactions to happen, and they cause our muscles to contract as well. So proteins are the worker molecules. The nucleus. The structure of the nucleus, it's the sphere in the middle of the cell. And it's enclosed in a double membrane, and we call that the nuclear envelope or the nuclear membrane. And you can see in the diagram, it's basically two layers of membrane, and it has these little pores, which are holes in the membrane, which controls which substances can go in and out. The function of the nucleus is the control center of the cell. So that's where the DNA is found, all wrapped up in chromosomes, which also includes protein. And the DNA, well, the nucleus controls DNA replicating as well, which is when the DNA makes a copy of itself so the cell can divide. And since the DNA is in there, this is the start of gene expression. It's the start of how proteins get made. The nuclear envelope, like I said, it surrounds the nucleus. It's a bilayer, which means two layers of membrane. And it has those nuclear pores, which allow chemicals in and out. And so that's the function of the nuclear membrane, to control what enters and what leaves. which basically is the same function as the whole cell membrane as well, which we'll look at later. The nucleolus is next. It's the dark circle that you can see in the nucleus. Here's a nice electron microscope view. So they're not always a perfect circle. This one's pretty oval shaped or ellipsoid. And the nucleolus makes the ribosomal RNA to build the ribosomes. So the nucleolus makes the ribosomes make the protein. Mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. That's the one organelle people normally remember. In terms of their structure, you can see they're shaped basically like jelly beans, and they have this folded membrane on the inside. And if we're thinking of surface area to volume, if you have lots of folds, we've got a high surface area compared to volume. And those folds are really important because that's where these chemical reactions happen, which is the process of cellular respiration. Respiration doesn't mean breathing. We often use it to mean that in everyday language, but ventilation is breathing. Cellular respiration is this chemical process that all cells do, and they use glucose to produce ATP. And ATP is the energy molecule that cells use. So that's why we call it the powerhouse of the cell. The actual chemical formula for cellular respiration is we take glucose, we add oxygen. That's why we need to breathe in oxygen and send it to all our cells. And it produces carbon dioxide as a waste. That's why we breathe it out. And it also produces water, which actually is useful, and we use the water that's produced from cellular respiration. But as part of that process, ATP molecules get made. So they're technically not a product, but they start as ADP and then they become ATP as part of the process. And now those molecules are scattered around the cell and they can be used whenever it needs to use some energy for something. And if we think about structure relating to function, if we have cells with really high energy requirements, then they're going to have lots of mitochondria. For example, muscle cells constantly need to be contracting and expanding, and that takes a lot of energy. So they've got a lot of mitochondria to produce the ATP they need. The endoplasmic reticulum. This is the maze-like structure that you can see inside a lot of cells, in eukaryotic cells. So it's a network of folded membranes. There's some of them that you can see here that have ribosomes on, and some that don't. And the one with ribosomes on we call the rough endoplasmic reticulum, like I said earlier, and we call the one without them is the smooth, because it looks like it's got a smooth surface. So the endoplasmic reticulum, it's the production and the delivery system, essentially. And they both have slightly different jobs. So the smooth ER, it produces fats and oils, which we call lipids, and it stores them away, because lipids don't dissolve in water. So the smooth endoplasmic reticulum is the place where lipids can be stored without them having to try and dissolve in water. And it also detoxifies harmful substances, particularly alcohol and poisons. Well, alcohol is a poison if you have too much of it. So those chemicals will go to the smooth ER and they'll be broken down and detoxified, and hopefully not cause too much damage. The rough ER has ribosomes attached to it, which should be the clue that we're going to be producing proteins. So these particular proteins that get made here, they are ones that require extra modification, because some ribosomes, remember, just stay floating in the cytosol, and they produce proteins ready to be used that don't need modifying. But the proteins that need modifying, they get made in these ribosomes up in the rough ER, and then the proteins move inside it and they get processed and they get packaged and then they get transported where they need to go. Vesicles are next, or vesicles. So essentially, vesicles are the most simple organelle. They're just a membrane in a sphere. So they're just an open sac. And I think of them as cardboard boxes. So if the cell needs to store something, it puts it in a vesicle and it can keep it there, it can store it, or it can transport it wherever it needs to go. There's also a few specific types of vesicles. So lysosomes are still vesicles, but they're filled with digestive enzymes. And similar to the enzymes that are in our stomach, they break down big molecules, which we call macromolecules. Macro meaning big. And the lysosomes, they also break down organelles that have broken or that have passed their useful life, and they also break down foreign material. So lysosomes are basically like a recycling factory. There's also a similar type of vesicle called peroxisomes. Again, they're filled with enzymes, and they help to break down toxic substances too, like the smooth endoplasmic reticulum does. They're also used for specifically breaking down lipids, which are fats, to make ATP for energy. So we can also, whenever we eat fatty foods, we can also get energy out of those fats, and that happens in the peroxisomes, partially. The Golgi apparatus is next. It's also called the Golgi complex and the Golgi body. Biologists love to name things with many names. So when you look at a Golgi apparatus, it looks like a stack of pancakes. Nice and easy to visualize. And they're not pancakes, they're multiple layers of membranes, and they're channels, so they're hollow on the inside. The function of the Golgi apparatus is basically like a post office, or like the Amazon warehouse. They receive the proteins that come from the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and the proteins get carried in vesicles. And then once they arrive at the Golgi apparatus, they package the proteins anymore, they do any extra modification that need to be done, and then just like a post office, they label the proteins for where they need to be delivered. And then once they're ready to go, the proteins leave the Golgi in a vesicle, and you can see these vesicles here are moving towards the edge of the cell, and then they touch the cell membrane, and then the vesicle basically joins with the cell membrane and releases all the proteins outside the cell. And that's what you can see here in this process. And that whole process is called exocytosis. A vesicle joins with the cell membrane and releases whatever it's carrying, in this case proteins, out of the cell. Exo means outwards. Alright, the cytoskeleton is next, and here are some amazing electron microscope pictures. Like always, they've been colorized because electron microscopes only ever come out black and white. These ones actually won some awards in the whatever International Microscopy Awards. And you can see from those pictures, cytoskeletons look like a whole lot of filaments and tubes in a really complex network. And the cytoskeleton is just like a human skeleton. So its job is to hold the cell and the organelles in place, gives the cell structure. It also acts as a railroad, so when organelles need to move, they can follow along one of those protein filaments in the cytoskeleton, so they can use it as a railway track. And it also helps chromosomes to move when cells divide during mitosis. So as always, if we're thinking about a scientific word, cyto means cell, so it just means the cell skeleton. There are 3 different types of proteins that make up the cytoskeleton. There's microtubules, which are the big ones, intermediate filaments, and microfilaments, which are the small ones. Alright, flagella and cilia. These organelles help unicellular eukaryotes to move around. Let's look at flagella first. So the structure of a flagella, it just looks like a tail, and it's essentially a single strand of proteins, and they're surrounded by a little membrane around them. And just like the tail of a snake, the flagella either whips along back and forth, or it spins in a spiral motion like the propeller on a boat. And so both of those motions cause that little cell to swim along and move forwards. Because unicellular organisms, like this little species here, they need to swim through their environment to either catch food or to find light if they have chloroplasts, so that they can survive as best they can. And that's what flagella and cilia do. Cilia, on the other hand, are really tiny. They're also made of proteins, but obviously they're a lot smaller. And a cell that's a ciliate, covered in cilia, is going to have them all the way around the cell. And what happens is one of these cilia will spin around basically like oars on a boat, or just like you spinning your arms around as you're paddling, and they're all acting like a tiny little oar to push that cell through the water. So they use a sweeping motion to cause locomotion. Alright, chloroplast is next. And chloroplasts are only found in plant cells and some protists. The structure of a chloroplast, it's the other jelly bean shaped one, so a similar shape to a mitochondrion. That's the singular of mitochondria. And inside the chloroplast, you've got these little stacks of pancake-like membranes. Really clear, a nice, neat stack of membranes. And again, lots of membranes means a high surface area, so there's lots of space for these chemical reactions to happen. And the really important chemical reaction that happens in chloroplasts is photosynthesis. Possibly the most important chemical reaction in the world, because this is how pretty much every ecosystem gets food and energy into it. And what actually happens in photosynthesis? Well, the chloroplast takes in sunlight, uses the energy from the sunlight. It also uses carbon dioxide from the air, and it uses that to make glucose, which essentially are food molecules. Like I said, they're only found in plants, plus some algae, which are protists. And the actual chemical inside chloroplasts is chlorophyll, and that's what gives them their green color. And that's what makes plants green, because chlorophyll reflects green light. And it's the chlorophyll which literally traps the light energy and helps it to do photosynthesis. So if we're thinking to the chemical reaction of photosynthesis, it's literally the reverse if we summarize it. So photosynthesis takes in CO2. It also needs water. It uses the energy from the sun, and then it makes oxygen and glucose. So that's why plants and algae are the bottom of the food chain. They can just sit there in the environment, they can collect sunlight, make their own food, and they never need to go hunting for food. Whereas animals, we're further up in the food chain because we have to go and hunt and collect our food to get our energy. Cell wall is next. The structure of a cell wall it's located outside the cell membrane, and it's a thick layer on the outside. So if we draw a typical cell, we've got the cell membrane, and then if it's a plant cell or a fungus, it's going to have a thick layer around the outside, and that part on the inside is the cell wall. And its job, just like a wall, is to give strength to the cell. You can see in the summary here, the cell walls are different in different groups of species. So all fungi have a cell wall, and all plants have one, but they're made of different things. And most bacteria, which are prokaryotes, have a cell wall, but again it's completely different to eukaryotes ones. And most archaea, which are the other group of prokaryotes, they're also quite different in their makeup. Vacuole is next. And the vacuole looks like a giant vesicle, which basically it is. It often looks like a swimming pool or just a lake when you see an artist's impression of a cell. So it's just a large sac surrounded by a single membrane. And the vacuole stores nutrients, it stores salts and water and wastes and other food chemicals if needed. The other important job though is to give the cell strength. So the vacuole works in partnership with the cell wall in plants particularly, using this process here. So we've all seen when a plant wilts if you don't give it enough water. So when plant cells dry out, all the water leaves the cytosol and it leaves the vacuole, and it becomes this state here, which is called plasmolyzed. But when you give it, when it rains again or you water the plant, the vacuole fills up with lots of water. Water enters the cell, fills up the cytosol, and fills up the vacuole. And the vacuole is basically like a giant balloon on the inside of the cell. So if you're blowing up a balloon inside the cell, it's going to push outwards on the cell, and the cell wall is going to become nice and rigid and hold itself together. And so that's why plants can hold themselves up. Like the leaves of a tree hold themselves out quite neatly without needing to have a skeleton, which for animals, we don't have a cell wall and we don't have a vacuole, so we can't hold ourselves up without having a bony skeleton. Here's a little bit more detail about cell walls in plants. So I didn't mention earlier that they're made of thick fibers outside the cell membrane. We've already talked about that they're used in protection and they give shape and support to the cell. The cell membrane is the last one we'll talk about now. So the technical name is the plasma membrane. It's the thin boundary around every single cell. So from the very first cells that ever evolved, they've always had a cell membrane. It's made of these chemicals called phospholipids, which we'll learn more about later. And the function of the plasma membrane, it's basically like the bouncer at the front of a nightclub, or it's like customs at the airport. They're controlling what can go in and what can go out of the cell, which is really important so the cell can maintain its regulated state. We draw cell membranes as a really simple line. They are a lot more complex though. So these are all the details that we'll be learning about in the next topic. Okay, those are all the organelles found in eukaryotic cells. So we're going to finish on just a comparison of animal cells and plant cells and what they have. So plants is probably the easiest. Plant cells are unique because they have chloroplasts compared to animals, and they have a cell wall, and they have that large vacuole. There is a small vacuole here in this animal cell. Generally, we just call that a small vesicle. Most of the other organelles are found in both plants and animals. So they all have endoplasmic reticulum, they all have a Golgi apparatus, they all have ribosomes, all have mitochondria, they have a nucleus with everything that it contains, and vesicles are found in both. They're just not labelled on the plant. Every cell has a plasma membrane. Every cell has cytoplasm and cytosol. And there are a few differences in the cytoskeleton. So they've said microtubules here, but both plants and animals do have a cytoskeleton. And we don't need to know the differences for us. So it's really about plants having those few extra organelles that help them to do their photosynthesis job and to help them to maintain their structure with their cell wall. Okay, that's all the organelles in eukaryotic cells.